Good afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Donna Williams, Chief Audience Development Officer here at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I want to welcome you to our museum and also to this afternoon's program, Provocative Visions, Race, and Identity. A panel discussion is going to be hosted by, of course, the Metropolitan Museum and the New York Times Community Affairs Department. And this event is sponsored by Aetna, and we thank them all very much. Thank you. Before we start, I hope you all had a chance to enjoy the images that were on the screen behind us. These photos were taken by our visitors, and they are part of a campaign that we're doing, and it will be posted on Flickr. So actually, the photos that you saw on the wall can be part of your selection if you take part in our contest. This contest, as I mentioned, is posted on Flickr, an online post-sharing website. And if you're interested in sharing your Met Museum experiences with us, you're welcome to pick up a flyer that will be in the back, and it describes It's Time We Met. It's going on right now, and it will be over on March 7th, so hopefully you will share your experiences with us, because as you can tell, we had some fantastic images. So please pick up those flyers on your way out. But now, most importantly, I am so excited to welcome you to this panel discussion. I want to first introduce you to Lisa Messenger. She's Associate Curator for the Met's Department of 19th-Century Modern and Contemporary Art. I hope you enjoy your afternoon. I know I will, and I'm so happy that you joined us. Thank you. Changing of the guard.
Okay. Thank you all for coming to this afternoon's panel discussion for the museum's current exhibition, Provocative Visions, Race and Identity. As Donna said, I'm Lisa Messenger, and I am the organizer for the exhibition. Before we gather our panel on stage, I'd like to give you a quick overview of the exhibition and point out some of the recurrent themes that appear in these works. On the screen are three artists who have found a way to connect to their African roots through images that also comment on issues in contemporary American society. At top left is Kara Walker, and going clockwise, Allison Saar and Willie Cole. We'll see some of these later in my presentation. Here's the gallery where the show is held on the mezzanine level of the Modern Art Wing. It contains 13 pieces by 7 well-known contemporary African-American artists, all of whom are dealing with issues of race, gender, and identity, and ask in different ways, how do we perceive ourselves, and how are we perceived by others? Although, as you can tell, this is a fairly small exhibition, it has certainly resonated with our audiences, and our attendance figures are high. Since opening the show in August, we have had more than 145,000 visitors, and there's still a month to go if you haven't seen it yet. Entering the gallery, you are immediately confronted with Chakaia Booker's menacing cut radial tire sculpture, which sets the tone for the exhibition. Aggressive and overtly sexual, it demands attention even as it repels our advances with sharp wires and blade-like shapes. As with the other artists in this show, all of whom were born in the 1950s and 60s, the impact of the civil rights movement, the Black Power, women's movements, sexual revolution, are all strongly felt in their choice of subjects and modes of expression. This past spring, the museum acquired 3 works by Willie Cole, 2 sculptures and a print triptych. And you can see the triptych on the far left, the sculptures on the pedestal in the foreground on the right. And these works became the impetus for the show. It's really a rare occurrence for the museum to be able to show new acquisitions within months of their being part of the collection. And in many cases, things are brought into the collection but don't get shown for many years. As soon as we acquired these works, I was very excited and wanted to, of course, put them out as soon as possible, and it just so happened that there was a space in our exhibition schedule because the gallery that the show is in is really a rotation of our collection, and we just feature different aspects. There's not a lot of planning for these shows. We know that we're going to do 3 or 4 a year, and depending on the interests of the curator, it can be anything from watercolors or, landscape painting, small portraits, and in this case, the Provocative Visions show. But in addition to showing these 3 new acquisitions, I realized that we were also debuting 8 other works that had been in the collection for the past 13 years. Here's a better view of that Cole sculpture on the left, which, as you can see, is a strong male head based on the carved and painted wooden heads from Cameroon that you can see in our African galleries in the museum. But incongruously, they are made up of women's shoes. Turning ordinary objects like tires and shoes and bicycle parts into artistic materials is another common thread that runs through the exhibition. And as it happens, the 3 speakers that are going to be on our panel, the 3 artists, are all ones that work in 3-dimensional media. A lot of the exhibition are prints and drawings otherwise, but these are the few artists that work in sculptural mode. There's also a tendency to transform the human body in expressive and unexpected ways. In Alison Saar's Sweeping Beauty, for example, on the right, a woman morphs into a broom. While in Kara Walker's print, an African maiden free falls through the air like a rag doll. Whitfield Lovell's soft charcoal drawings, on the other hand, depict characters that evoke nostalgia for the past, one that has been lost and is reinvented by the artist with the help of old photographs upon which these portraits are based and collected objects that he places with them. Let me see, did I skip over? Sorry, my slides are a little whacked. Okay. Oh no, it's not the slides, it's my paper. Oh no, I've lost a whole section. Okay, I'm gonna have to wing this. This is Glenn Ligon's print. It's one of 4 prints from a series, and they're based on literary sources. Most of the artists in the exhibition that you see are using visual sources that they are adapting and changing and interpreting. But Glenn Ligon is using, in this case, literary sources. He's basing this print on this one line from Zora Neale Hurston's 1928 essay, and it's "I do not always feel colored," and it repeats and repeats until at the bottom the lettering is so blurred that it's just really a black smudge. Another work in the same series is based on Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and he takes an entire passage and prints that, but what he does in those 2 prints is print black lettering on black paper. And so in fact, the words of the author are almost as invisible as the phrase, "I am an invisible man," that is what he's printing. I seem to have lost a slide here. I was going to talk about also another artist who had used photography, Lorna Simpson, is in the show. And her diptych is a comparison of two women. They're based on vintage photographs, and she prints these images side by side. One is a young woman seated in a photographer's studio from the 40s behind a ridiculously large paper moon. And it's compared to a film still of Lena Horne, the great singer and actress. And it's alluding to the unattainable, possibly unattainable goals and standards that women often set themselves up against. As we've seen in just these few slides, and even fewer than I intended, artists are looking at many different visual sources for inspiration. And the show has been a great experience for me to be able to present to our audience a whole new side of our collection that is not often on view. In this case, a lot of the works are on paper and therefore can't be out in the galleries for long periods of time due to light, making paper darker by being out in light. And so as a preservation means, a lot of these things are in closets and storerooms most of their lives. But now, this is another side of the gallery, so you can see the other half of the works. Without further ado, let me run down today's program for you. We're going to start with individual slide presentations by our three artists, Whitfield Lovell, Willie Cole, and Chakaia Booker, after which we will gather a group on the stage. The group will include curator Lowry Stokes Sims and journalist Charles M. Blow, who will be our moderator. And we hope that will be a lively discussion for everyone. You've already seen examples of each artist that will be here today. We've seen their work. But by way of further introduction, I'd just like to say that all of these artists have established their careers in the late 1980s and early 90s, and since then have been recognized with numerous exhibitions, publications, and awards. Their work is presented in major American collections, museum collections, and each one has recently had a mid-career survey of their work in the New York metropolitan area. Our fourth panelist, Lowry Sims, was on staff at the Metropolitan Museum of Art from 1972 to 1999, where she specialized in modern and contemporary art. Her acquisitions during this time formed the basis of this exhibition. After leaving the Met, she became executive director, president, and adjunct curator at the Studio Museum in Harlem from 2000 to 2007, and is currently serving as curator at the Museum of Arts and Design in New York. Our moderator today is Charles M. Blow, the op-ed columnist for the New York Times, where his column and award-winning graphs and charts appear every other Saturday. Please welcome our panelists to the stage, and thank you for coming. Let's see if I can see who's coming. Charles Blow, our moderator. Whitfield Lovell, one of our artists. Willie Cole, Chakaia Booker, and Lowry Sims at the end. Yeah, I think, do you want to just tell them about the card?
Sure. When you walked in, you should have gotten a note card and pencils. If you could fill those out while each of the artists give their presentations. When they're finished, the ushers will come through the aisles and collect them. We'll have a little bit of a discussion here, and while we're doing that, they'll go through the questions so we can have a bit of a question-answer session at the end of the presentation. So from there, we can start with the presentations.
Yeah, well, Whitfield, I think we're letting you go first, and you just have to push the forward button. to get the first slide and any other ones you want.
Well, this, I tried to include 6 slides that would give a certain, sort of an overview of my work over the past 10 years or so. This piece is part of an installation called Whispers, what is it? Whispers from the Walls? Whispers from the Walls. It's 1999, so, you know, I've done a lot of work since then. I began doing these installations with wall drawings and incorporating found objects, and so I got an opportunity to make a full-scale installation in Denton, Texas, which incorporates the drawings, which are done in charcoal directly on the vintage boards. And the house, the cabin, was actually built from scratch, from old lumber that we scrounged and bought in Denton. And all of the objects were purchased or found there. And also, I should mention that the piece commemorated a community, an African-American settlement in, that had been forced to disperse from Denton back in 1923. This piece is called Shine. When I'm not making full-scale installations, with the Whispers from the Walls piece, it's a cabin which is like 16 by 14 feet. And the viewer enters in through the front door and engages and then exits through the rear door. When I'm not making full-scale installations, I'm making these tableau works in my studio. So this piece is called Shine, and the objects are shoe shine boot rests on the box and actual shoes that are attached. I've been interested in the period between the emancipation and the civil rights movement. That's because of my grandparents and my experience going to the South every summer as a kid. I've just developed a sort of feel for imagery from that period, and also the history of that period. This is portion of an installation that I did in Richmond. It was called Visitation, the Richmond Project, and it was commemorative of Jackson Ward, which was the first Black entrepreneurial community in the country. And I should mention that the image of the soldier is a Civil War soldier, which, you know, I was invited to Richmond to do this installation about Jackson Ward, but when I got there, I realized that the Civil War history was so there that I had to touch upon that somehow. This piece is called Train. These are foundry molds, which I find and I work on. And here is a view of another installation. This was in Virginia. It was in Virginia at the Virginia Beach Contemporary Art Museum. The piece was called Sanctuary, the Great Dismal Swamp, and it was inspired by the Dismal Swamp, which is a 22,000 square mile swampland between North Carolina and Virginia, where runaway slaves hid for centuries. There were actually communities of runaway slaves that hid out there, and they actually made, they got provisions from the outside by making shingles out of the juniper trees. So I got the mulch. We got actual trees that were slated to be cut down, and we stood them up in the gallery. And I tried to create, as you were walking through the installation, I tried to create a sense of as with Whispers from the Walls and other installations, of transformation of time and place, so that you forget that you're in a gallery or a museum, and you're transformed into another space. The way that the mulch was placed was actually very sort of lumpy and uneven, because I wanted the feeling that you have when you're trudging through the woods and so on. Now this is this is one piece of my latest series, which is called the Kin series. They are drawings that are done from ID photos. Usually with the tableau pieces, I have used these like studio portraits, but here I'm working with pictures that are taken for official purposes. Some of them are taken from police mugshots, some are taken for passports or other reasons like that. And so it's not about having yourself immortalized for vanity purposes. It's more about something else. And the fact that they're done on paper, I find really interesting how the objects seem to become so delicate and so precious, and to be sort of they activate the image, and they're all framed in deep shadow boxes. And that's the last of my slides.
We didn't change the order of yours, did we? Oh, yes, I'm sorry. You're up.
Okay.
Yes, go right ahead.
So I've never had a comfortable talk where I'm sitting down like this.
You're welcome to stand at the podium if you want.
No, I don't want to break the flow of it.
Do whatever you like.
But, I came to the awareness of being a creative visual artist through painting. But sometime around the mid-'80s, I started to do assemblage, which evolved into three-dimensional sculpture. This piece is, although it looks like it could be a painting, it was really my attempt to figure out how I would paint if I was still doing paintings. Thinking about some of the artists that I like, the look that I like, the feel that I like in things. And my current sculpture habits have to do with collecting lots of individual objects, like a room full of shoes, a room full of irons, a room full of bicycles, so that when I'm working, I only have to deal with one object at a time. I don't have to make any choices because every object in the room is the same object. But unfortunately, I still have to make choices. I got to choose the right one. I got to choose the one that's the right size, the right texture, the right color, and it drives me crazy. But I think that drive towards madness helps me to get out of my sense of self, so that I'm just free and open to explore and experience the energy that's coming from the objects. So in that process of sifting through the shoes in my shoe studio, there are some pieces that I've made where I take the heels off of the shoes. So this is actually a painting made from the heels taken off of thousands of high-heel shoes. And I wish it was that big. Maybe I should paint it that big. But I think that each panel is maybe 4 by 4 or 2 by 2. I don't remember. But there's one in your museum now, too. Yeah, they're 2 by 2. 2 by 2, okay. And I see each heel as a brushstroke. I think I did this maybe a year and a half ago. Now, before, like everybody now tells me I'm in shoe business. So before I was in shoe business, I was the Iron Man, before the movie came out. And my self as the Iron Man is represented here. I'm representing the various domestic tribes in the U.S., the tribe of Silex and the tribe of Sunbeam. So the Silex man is dressed in his ceremonial garb, his ritual garb, rather, and the Sunbeam man on your right is dressed in his ceremonial garb. So to speak briefly about the iron thing, so I went from the painting to doing assemblages, making jewelry for myself to wear, but I found an iron on the street that had been run over by a car, and it looked like an African mask. Before I made work with irons, my work didn't have such a strong African overtone. So the look of my work really comes from the objects that I use. As a painter, I was pretty much, I thought I was more of an illustrator than a painter. And I didn't paint anything that was abstract. I was also write stories. A lot of my paintings were just illustrations for stories that I'd written. When I started with the irons, the single iron became the story as well as the illustration for the story. So that in the U.S., many brands of steam irons, I began to see each iron as a domestic tribe used by domestic workers. So I tried to take that back to the earliest domestic workers, which were slaves or indentured servants. So I began to depict the iron as a ritual object or ceremonial object used by the house Negroes once they get out with the field Negroes, and they're doing some sort of African ritual. And it was mostly through sculpture, but after about 7 years, I began to include myself in this work as the image of that particular worker. So that's what this one is here. This exists as 2 separate pieces where each one is 5 feet. This particular piece here is both the silex and the sunbeam together, and it's slightly smaller than 5 feet. This piece was commissioned by the AGO Museum in Toronto back in the fall. They had a great addition added to their building, a Frank Gehry design, and a collector named Mary Frum, who I'm sure the Met probably has some of his stuff here. He collects African art. He donated a large part of his collection to the AGO Museum. So they decided they needed to have some contemporary art that made the bridge between their modernist and their African collection. And they thought I was the guy. So they commissioned 3 pieces. And because the commission was in the fall, for me, I had to make it out of shoes because I'm in the shoe thing right now. So I made it out of shoes. This has 4 faces, but you can't see all 4, but you can definitely see one in the front there. So it's kind of inspired by the, I think it's called Bundu or Bandu mask. It's like a helmet mask. And it's my first time making one with 4 faces. I don't work from any sketches. Like I said, I'm just inspired by the material. So the shape of the shoe determines what the piece will look like. I have like a memory of so many things I've seen in my life. I guess most artists do. I used to come here a lot and go through the Rockefeller Wing like almost every weekend. So I was able to make something that looks like it's related to a particular culture or a particular region or a particular tribe without actually looking at the thing and going back and forth from my thing to the thing in the book. But just having memory of all these things comes through in the work. I use a single object because in the 70s, I was in a lot of assemblage shows, rather in the early 80s, in Newark. Assemblage was real big in Newark in the 80s. And all the artists were using all kinds of objects mixed together. And I felt that you couldn't tell one of us from the other because all of our assemblages were made out of every and anything. So I decided to narrow my thing down to a single object. That's part of the impetus for that choice. But also I just get tired of, like, you go to the supermarket, there are like 20 kinds of soap when all you need is soap. So I felt the same way about the art materials. You know, if you're making a building, you can use brick. Every brick looks alike, so it's kind of like that. I often say now that, actually it changed this week, I used to say it's like having a puzzle, all the pieces in a plastic bag, not having a box, not having a picture, so not know what it looks like, but knowing it all goes together. That's what making this is like. But my daughter bought me a Rubik's Cube for Christmas, so now I say it's like having a Rubik's Cube that can never be solved. So, let's see what's next here. This goes back to the Iron Man days. This piece would be good in a book called Willie Cole, Iron Man, because this represents all the tribes around there in the form of the Iron Prince, and the middle is the slave ship that brought them to the U.S. It's a wood block print. The objects are actually embedded into the wood, like the negative shape is cut out, and the iron board is put in there. The irons are put in there as well. This is 8 feet by something, maybe 8 by 5. And this piece came about at a time when I was relocating my studio and cleaning up. And I found a book that my mom had in her library when I was a kid called the Johnson's Publications Guide to Negro History. And it had a picture of the Brooks slave ship in the center fold of the publication. So this was kind of inspired by that. This one that's about 8 feet diameter, so it's a flower, basically. I call it With a Heart of Gold. And I used to know how many shoes that is. It's a lot of shoes. It might be close to 1,000 shoes. So when I first started with the shoes, I had just a few high-heel shoes. And I bang them together for months because I'm trying to not know what I'm doing in the studio. I'm just trying to experience creative process by feeling and collecting the energy that's around, either from other artists down the block, other artists that were there in the same space 40 years ago, in my own memory. So I don't have a concept. I'm just banging, banging, banging. After about 3 months, I noticed that the shoes look like sharp teeth, the spike on high-heel shoes. So I made a mouth. And that started my whole shoe thing. After I made that mouth and I made a head, my immediate references were my childhood and cartoons I'd seen on TV. But then, after traveling around to a couple museums, like to Cornell University and the Newark Museum, where they had a lot of Tibetan art at that time, I realized the faces that I made look like the protectors, the so-called protector spirits of Tibet Buddhism. So I began to explore the imagery inside those paintings and noticed the presence of beautiful flowers in nature and things like that. So then I could talk forever, so I'm going to try to keep it. I think I'm almost at my last slide. Try to recognize that everything that exists somewhere else in another form. Every shape is the same shape. Everything breaks down to one thing. Like this whole room is all one thing. You all dress different, you look different, but you are all actually the same, broken down to your smallest particle. So I begin to see everything as one thing. So this work here has just kind of grown out of that. And the way that I challenge that and make that happen is if the one thing that I find myself making, like one shoe, doesn't look like part of a flower, not normally, but if you forget the size of it and think of it as a particle, then anything is possible. So that's how this one came about. Oops, that's it. Thank you.
Hello. Well, I started off utilizing textiles and fabrics growing up and moved on into ceramics. being here in the city back in the 80s, there were lots of retread tires and lots of car fires going on all over the city, and I would go about collecting discarded materials, and the automobile tire was there. I used these materials and incorporating them into some of the wearable art pieces that I created at the time, and also creating sculpture. I guess I woke up one day and was very interested in doing very large-scale works and pieces for public art, and needed a surface treatment that would be able to go outdoors. I guess initially I thought about metal fabrication, and then when I went to graduate school, I ended up going back into discarded materials, which is something I was familiar with. And of course, the automobile tire was always there. When I began to understand how to break the automobile tire into something that I could consider as a material, the works that you will see are the things that I create today. Being a person interested in public art, there are, of course, lots of other materials. The automobile tire is my primary material, but I'm interested in creating works in bronze and stainless and also stone, and here's a selection of them. This particular piece was made last year for the Kemper Museum, and this is called the Fatality of Hope. This particular work was an installation that went into the Storm King Art Center, and this piece, working with works outside with rubber, because I usually use the steel-belted tires in order to create the works. This work was done for Indianapolis, which was an installation that was done, works that were put in the downtown area of Indianapolis. And this is utilizing tires that don't have the steel belt in them, so it made it very accessible for the public to have hands-on with the art and the material. And this is called Gridlock. Serendipity was a piece that was created for the Public Art Fund, which was displayed at the Metropolitan Center in Brooklyn. Conversion, still going back, utilizing some of the other discarded materials with the rubber. This particular piece was created last year, 2008. And Wave, which is, again, thinking about the public art. This work was done for a commission in Hudson County in Jersey City. And this is created, made of stainless steel. Thank you.
We don't need this anymore. Great. So now the ushers are going to come through the aisles and pick up the cards with your questions on them, and we're going to talk among ourselves for a little while. That was great, by the way. I want to start the conversation with a bit of background and your feeling about being in a show like this and what it means to you, and I think to the museum as well. I mean, part of the material I got for this panel raised this question of whether or not it's even a good idea to have all black shows. And in fact, one artist specifically said, I don't want to be in an all black show. And kind of to you, Lowry, like how did these pieces come to be in the museum's collection? And to the artist, like what is your feeling about that, the show that you're now in? Yeah, whoever.
I didn't know it was a show until it became a show. So I was glad that the Met purchased my work, and then I was glad to hear that it was going to be shown. I didn't know that it was going to be this configuration of the show until, just before it became official, I guess. I had had many years where I chose not to be in shows that were all black.
Why is that?
Because it's, there's so many reasons. One thing is I don't want to be curated based on race. Okay. And although curating by race, as they say, has been very good to me. I can remember in the 70s, in Newark, the only time I can get a review in the Times was during Black History Month. So that allowed me to come to New York with a stack of reviews, even though they were all in February. They were still reviews. But I think that, everything that once you put the race label on things, it's very close to divide and conquer, If there were more people of color in so-called mainstream exhibitions, this little separation wouldn't be as big a point where you're going to discuss it with us. Mm-hmm. But the fact that you bring it up shows that it is overdone, and it's time to move on.
Anyone else?
Well, I share a lot of Willie's sentiments with that. I also began to decline Black History Month shows, all black shows, long ago. I think that the problem, one of the problems is that these shows that are all black are the only times that the work is brought out, The last and first time that my piece was on display was another all-black show with some other artists who were in the collection. Mm-hmm. And so I think, I see that there are similarities, there are themes that, I started thinking about my Shine piece with the shoes and then seeing Willie's piece, but I think that the dialogue could be greater if we were not sort of ghettoized. That the only time our works are on display, it's for a black show, and I think that the idea of sort of segregating contemporary art by race is no longer really necessary, and one of the most exciting shows that I saw recently was the one of the Philippe de Montebello's tribute, where there were all of these works that were of such disparate origins placed together in these galleries. And you see similarities between a Greek frieze and the Benin sculpture. So, that's my feeling.
So the subtext of that, is the subtext of that you think that it somehow diminishes the impact of the work if it's grouped so that the juxtaposition is not as strong as it would be in a broader context?
I think that by being segregated as African American artists, that in itself is diminishing. And particularly, as I said, because that's the only time our works are brought out. And the only time that we have even panel discussions about black art is in February. So.
Don't laugh before you even answer the question.
Well, my hope is that the work, because it's work that has not been done before, can have its own sort of recognition that there's been something that has been accomplished. And instead of looking at the source in other ways, you should look at the work and be able to understand that it hasn't been seen, it doesn't exist. And so have conversations about what that is about instead of the person who created it. You know, or at least not having that be the initial conversation, you know, where it begins. Now that I've shown on the bottom floor, it'd be nice to be on the top floor, on the roof.
And Lori?
Well, I come at it with a kind of broader, perspective, having sort of worked at this museum from 1972 and left it in 1999, then directed the Studio Museum in Harlem, and now working at the Museum for Arts and Design. I don't think that the situation for African American artists or any artist of color is what it was in 1972, for sure. I think that this is one instance, but in the broader spectrum, I think there is a much more a tendency to sort of really look at artists' work in a broad spectrum. I think we did so at the Museum of Arts and Design in our opening show, where we're looking at 51 artists from 17 countries who reuse material. And Chakaia's in the show, and Willie's in the show, and Whitfield's not in the show because he doesn't do things in repetition. But, hang in there, my brother. We'll sort of get there. But I think that what really is gratifying for me to have this show here at the Metropolitan Museum is that this is an institution that sort of moves with the times on its own time. No pun intended. And I think that when I saw the list, Lisa, sent me the list, I think there were several things that really struck me. First of all, a lot of the work was bought with the Moore Fund that was given by Larry and Madeline Moore back in the late 80s, when there was absolutely no support for Black art specifically in this institution. And the best thing for me is that Larry and Maddie Moore, who are now in their late 80s, have lived to see their legacy, receive some kind of recognition in the Metropolitan Museum. The other, there are several, bylines you'll see on the credits for it, but the other one is Peter Norton. And the works that were purchased by the Peter Norton Fund were very interesting because he used to give out grants to individual curators to buy what they wanted so that they could bypass all the kinds of approvals of the museums that they lived in. So I love that, So actually I was able to sort of bring in some works that, without much ado, that it would have been impossible, or I would have had to compete with other curators in 19 other departments, for, regular funds. So I think that I look upon it in that kind of context. There's another way that you can sort of say that the three artists here in two, represents, a kind of tendency of recycling materials that is prevalent, in a kind of Africanist aesthetic that you can find. In fact, Susan Vogel, when she did an exhibition about 15 years ago called Africa Explores, she quoted the Senegalese artist Fode Camara, who said that African art is the art of assemblage and recycling. And when we sort of look at their work in the context of El Anatsui, whose beautiful pieces in the textile show in the Department of Arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas, you can sort of see that there is an interesting and provocative kind of relationship among them that would, in a way, qualify, this sort of gathering of artists together. So I think
it's
today...
it's not curated to have like-minded or artists who do the same things. It's just, you're saying that artists of African descent more likely to do assemblage,
No,
Or you're
no,
not
no.
saying-
I don't want to say
Okay.
that. I don't want to say that. It's just in this case because there are some. I think that I think that Willie and Whitfield and Chakaia have all pointed to the fact that there is a very broad base of practices by African American artists today, so that you can bring some together by a way of working. But we have to recognize there are people who work abstractly, there are people who work figuratively, and I think what makes some shows more recently that bring together Black artists is that they seem to have a cogent theoretical theme that was very different from the 70s, where they throw in everybody, who had a Black grandmother into a show and, sort of make it an African American, show. So I always go back to that quotation from Du Bois, about African Americans being two warring souls in one entity. And I think that it's part of our task, to sort of both celebrate and define ourselves within our community, but also to sort of really demand recognition by the larger scene.
Right. Now let's talk about art. Chakaia, first, love the headdress. I mean, it's awesome. But Willie and Whitfield talked about why they came to the material they use. Could you talk a little bit about why tires? Why is it so prevalent in your work? Where you find so many tires? I mean, I'm very curious about it, and also what you see, or what you initially saw in the tires that you could envision as kind of more so organic, so kind of sensual, shapely forms, and how you came to that process.
Well, the material itself is infinite as far as possibilities. Again, starting from the 80s, the retreads, that was that material that they tried to re-glue on the tires, whether truck or vehicle tires. They were, lots of them just strewn around the highways and city streets. Again, in New York at the time, there were just so many car fires. I would wait until the cars would cool down, and I would sort of scrape this material off, and again, initially utilizing it into wearable pieces that I created. When I started thinking more of the sculptural possibilities and the fact that I wanted the pieces to be very large, working with the discarded material, using residential materials, your spoons, knives, forks, clothing into your commercial, your hardwoods, your lamps, any of the chairs and rug pieces that you're sitting on, and then also to a friend who has a farm and using agricultural materials there. The tires were always there. It was the process of being able to understand how to get the material to form into something that was an actual material that I could then be able to select and pick and change and transform what it was. The textures, the way the tires can occasionally come busted up, whether it's through just the wear or just an accident, those kinds of explosions and rips and tears were it was like a painter having a palette. The colors for a painter are the colors that have energy that helps them to create their composition. For me, it became the textures and the movements of these things that I began to collect, which was my palette, which I then in turn began to internalize and see the energies that they possessed and began to utilize them into the work. Again, starting from my initial base, coming up with my family that actually sewed and made clothing, I always, whatever material, discarded material, there's always that moment of being able to come back to that starting point. But then from there, it was working and thinking about sculpture. I needed surface treatment. Again, wanted metal fabrication, didn't have access to the welding, the materials, and all of those tools at the time to be able to create these pieces. The discarded materials again, from at the time when things began to happen for me, I mean, there was, the city had little money, so there was huge amounts of garbage that was constantly just left on the street. So it wasn't as if you had, I mean, it was just there. So I didn't have to look too hard. So again, it was just about the energy of the material. And again, it's just limited to your own personal imagination. There's just no limit to what you can do there. The flexibility, the changes for each year, the manufacturers create a different product, so it's not as if when I get this, it's always the same. There's a different language and dialogue that I've built up through the years, and I can understand certain things that I can do, but and always looking for each project to go beyond that, even though at times for the viewer it may seem very subtle, but we take subtle. Everything is not going to be that big bang and that big push all the time. But the correlation between thinking about the African culture and scarification, the color, all of those were there as well. But then after going through thousands of tires, you also begin to envision and see many cultures and many aspects of what those textures, once you begin to overlay them, cross them, you cut into them, that there was just a lot of information and a lot of ways of being able to have a dialogue and a conversation.
Your piece, Raw Attraction, is on exhibit upstairs. I spent a lot of time this morning, thank you, just hanging out, because I wanted to experience the art myself, but also I wanted to get a sense of how other people were experiencing it. A couple of tours were rolling through and people were able to talk, so I was able to actually hear how they were thinking about it. And, you know, I heard one person in a tour say something like, "It looks like a vicious vagina." I mean, they were having a very sexual, kind of sensual relationship with the piece. And when you look at, you know, some of the pieces, there's a lot of kind of, you know, sensuality to this very rough, I'm trying to be PC, sensuality to this very rough material. And I hadn't recognized what she was saying until she said it. And then the person who was giving the tour said, well, you know, this part looks like little stubby hair. I mean, it was really, they were really into it. But, but then I looked at it again and I said, huh. So, is that part of the mission of it? I mean, are you thinking that way when you're creating the piece? Or is you know?
Again, I think that the pieces hold a lot of energy, and the interpretation hopefully varies and brings about different ways to explore it for the individuals. I think that as the artist, I guess, of course, I will always, you know, input whatever my direction and thought is about the work, but I think that for the viewers, it's definitely something that is open because you have a 6-year-old, they may not see it quite that way, and we're not going to, you know, push any particular thought, but I think that the work, as well as the titles, have a very ambiguous way to presenting a presentation, and that there's just not one way to just say that it's just this.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that the work of all three artists really, you know, engages us in what we bring to our experience of different kinds of materials. You know, sometimes it's the aha movement, or that, what is that made out of? And then, you know, it's like, you know, this kind of revelation about it. But when, you know, you go to Willie's studio and you see 3,000 square feet with tables of chairs, then you worry about Willie's, you know, shoe fetish. But on the other hand, each one of those, I mean, I found myself trying, can I try these on? And, you know, and my assistant told me I couldn't. But it was like you have these inherent relationships to the individual components that they make up, or the wood that Whitfield uses in his work. It's always found wood, and it has traces of torn paper or muslin that's used to put on the wallpaper and things like that. And then he sort of brings it alive by inscribing these images of people who would have inhabited the spaces that the wood come from. So I think that there's an extraordinarily resonant kind of use of the materials by all three of these artists that implicate us in the experience and the meaning of it as much as their own individual expression.
Speaking of the shoe fetish, I was really struck by this kind of almost collision of the kind of consumer goods of irons and shoes and bicycles and very modern, very American material, and your ability to force it to recognize an African aesthetic. And I'm not sure if I was just, that's just me and the way I'm reading it and projecting that onto your work, or is that part of your thinking in the creation of the word?
Well, definitely the word force is not correct. I'm not forcing it. I try to approach not just my studio time, but my life in a way that is harmonious with the energy of nature all around me. Mm-hmm. So in the studio, I'm there like it's like showed up to daycare, be the only kid there. There's no teachers, no parents. I'm just there to play and let it flow. So
I'd like that job.
Definitely not forcing it. Consumer items. Can you name something that's not a consumer item?
No, but I guess my reaction was that it was kind of, particularly the pink bicycles. I mean, it moved me to where I was kind of confronting, this idea of things and wanting to possess things, right. And juxtaposing that to the echoes of Africa and things that possess me in a way. And those two things in my own mind were having a bit of a
Well, I think that the creative process just brings that out of you, and it came through the artist, but your reactions to the pieces, your interpretation of the pieces are just the way that spirit touches you. I don't have an intention to do anything other than to release the energy from the object. I don't know what the energy is going to be always, but I imagine with the pink bike, the little girl that owned it, her residue was all over that bike. So you felt some of her playfulness, and hey, I didn't see you there. So these things just come out of the work. It's not deliberate. Like I said, I'm not working from a sketch. And like Chakaia said earlier, I used to go around the fires also, because I knew every time a house burned down, I'd find a telephone and an ironing board and an iron. So I thought that was interesting.
And Whitfield, one thing that I was struck about your work, I mean, I grew up in a small town in Louisiana. It was a dying town, and we would there were always abandoned houses. And as kids, we would go into these spaces, and there were like these eerie, poetic spaces of things and the residue of a life, and spoons and plates. And there was, it was almost like you were entering a sanctuary of some sort, and it really echoed with that, with a lot of the work that you were doing, and it felt almost like you felt the need to document in a way. I mean, you talked about in the opening part about you going to the South a lot and feeling a connection to a certain period in the African American experience, and a lot of that work seems to attempt to document, humanize, and dignify people in a period. And I just would like you to talk about this concept of whether or not that kind of you have any kind of documentary urge, or is it just the art flows out of you the way that it?
I'm not trying to document. Probably everything else you've said is correct, but I have a problem with that word. Mm-hmm. I'm just feeling my way through. And when I'm feeling, when I'm responding to the lumber or to an old photograph of some anonymous person or some object that seems to be, I don't know, somehow spiritually speaking to me. I'm just inspired by all these things. I'm inspired by my memories of being in the South, particularly of my great Aunt Fanny, who lived in a cabin up the hill that was very much like that. I wasn't documenting her cabin so much as I was trying to capture a memory and to make that memory live for that moment, something in my memory that I wanted people to be able to touch and to feel, so.
And how much how much do you feel like, your, and I think this is to everybody on the panel, how much of the world, or do you even think of it this way, the world are you consciously trying to reflect through your lens, and just how much of it just feels like it's something inside of you that it is your own expressing, your own playground, your own desire to engage materials and to engage your thoughts and the images that you have inside of you and to let that out? Because I'm curious about just kind of environment and how much does, some sort of changing sense of racial identity have on you and your work, or does it have any effect at all, or is it, your work just born in you and it expresses itself however it expresses?
Well, big question. My sense is that while I'm inspired by my memories and things that were taught to me and shown to me by my relatives and my grandparents and my great Aunt Fanny, they're often very similar to memories and experiences that people of other backgrounds can relate to. I was very pleased when, let's see, it was one of the installations that I did went to Australia, and the Australians were having a dialogue about the way things were for their grandparents who first landed there in Sydney, when they had very little and they were sort of pioneers there. I was also, when the Whispers from the Walls was at the Studio Museum, I had a woman who was a Jewish lawyer who told me that the piece reminded her of her mother, her mother and her grandmother, because there were certain things with that installation. There was the outside of the cabin, the entire gallery was covered with old clothing that you had to walk over in order to enter the cabin, and that triggered a lot of memories for people of all walks of life, So I think while there's something that's particularly African American coming through my work, I think that's because that's the natural, I am African American. And at the same time, if an artist is European, they're probably dealing with symbols and, aspects of their own culture. But while I can relate to an artwork by, Rauschenberg, I think that at the same time, works that are done by people like us of African American backgrounds can speak to a larger audience.
I don't know how well we're doing on time, but I have a stack of questions here, and some of them are really good, so I want to get to them. The first one is, where is God in your work? Have you any experiences that connect to the Black religious experience? I guess they mean any of your work connects to the Black religious experience, or maybe not.
Well, Black religious experience, I don't know if you mean U.S., Baptist, Yoruba, Bahia, but because in my work I'm looking to release or discover energy in objects, I think that's kind of an African religion experience. I have looked at African art and have observed that when the piece is so dense that you can't see into it, you only can see the surface, but there's something inside because it's so tight, that gives you a certain feeling. It could be a feeling of fear. It could be just a feeling of wonder and intrigue. So I definitely have chosen to employ that experience. In terms of the Western religion, Christianity, I would say that the creative act itself is a religious experience. It's like the Bible says in the beginning was the Word. They don't say the word was art, unfortunately. But a lot of my work begins with the Word. When I was doing the steam iron pieces, after I found one iron on the street run over by a car, I made a list of words based on the word iron. Everything the iron made me think of, I made a list of that. Iron, the iron was black and silver, so iron, black went to Africa, Africa went to slavery, iron went to Ogun, so I was able to find a lot of things that begin with the word. So in that sense, I guess I had a Christian experience.
Very nice.
I'm reminded of Betsy Harvey, who's a self-taught artist from the South. When she was interviewed, somebody asked her about God and her work, and she said, we have to think about how the Lord's Prayer starts. Our Father who art in heaven.
I've heard that before.
Well, I have probably 5 or 6 cards here wanting to know where you get all these shoes, how much you pay for these shoes, where you make these shoes.
Well, I got to try to keep these answers short, too. My first shoes were not high heels, they were sneakers. And I got them from my son. He had saved every sneaker from like 2 to 8 years old. So when I began to play with those sneakers, at that time I was doing the painting thing. I had an idea what I wanted to do with those shoes and was unable to do it with just 8 pairs of sneakers, 16 shoes. So I went to my local thrift store right down the street from the studio at that time. And when I walked in there, I saw that the abundant shoe, the dominant shoe there was the high heel shoe. So I started buying them off the shelf. Off the shelf in the thrift stores back in those days, they were maybe between $2 and $5 a pair. But then I realized that, these thrift stores are kind of like McDonald's. They're on every corner, but they have a central headquarters that they're all connected to. So then I discovered the Salvation Army thrift store warehouse. So I go to the warehouse, I tell them what I am, who I am, what I plan to do, without making them seem to think I'm too weird. And I said, okay, well, I'll buy all the high heels you have. And that's how it started. And I've done that in 2 states. I've done it in New Jersey, and I've done that in Georgia. And so I have millions of shoes.
What were the different responses between New Jersey and Georgia? Same?
I think that, I give you some really wild details, but I'm not. In New Jersey, a lot of the shoes were like fun shoes, go-go shoes, maybe because it was the Essex County headquarters, which contains Newark. A lot of the shoes were like on the edge of, they were more like action fun shoes. Whereas Georgia, in the Bible Belt, the shoes reflect the Bible Belt. Not a lot of spikes, a lot of clunky heels, low pumps, things like that. And very subdued colors, whereas in Jersey, got some vibrance, some two-tones, some textures. So that was the difference. And of course, the final answer to that was by the pound, they charged me 50 cents a pound. So it's a better buy. I will go buy a single pair now if I find that I just need one more red shoe. Then I'll go to the store and I'll go through their red shoes. But I don't really buy too many shoes anymore. Okay.
Now, we're winding down a little bit, so I just want to ask each of you guys to talk about what you're working on now. I mean, you showed one piece, which is very different from your previous work, and I just want to have you talk a little bit about evolution of your work. What are you working on now? How it's different, or maybe it's the same as what you've done in the past, continuing a theme, but what is your work like today?
Okay. Well, I'm working on several things at once. When I had this commission that led to that piece from the AGO, it broke me through to a new awareness of that shape of the shoe, and a new awareness of what I could actually do. So I have spent the past few months focusing on the image of a mother and child, which is a reoccurring theme in art from all over Africa. So I'm working on that in my main studio, but also, working on public commissions that don't involve shoes. And I am working on some what might be called contemporary African-American memorabilia for a show at the Amistad Center in Hartford, Connecticut, where they want me to do something that's inspired by their collection of African-American memorabilia. So to that end, I've been looking at various things that I remember from my life, like the Amos and Andy show. I've looked at that a little bit. I've looked at the movie Birth of a Nation. I've been able to find parts of these movies that if I just take out like a 2-second clip and reverse it next to itself and then repeat it, it becomes a movement that reminds me of something in pop culture today. For example, I found a guy, there's a scene in Birth of a Nation where supposedly the big all-black Congress in North Carolina, and they were passing bills about black men now can marry white women. And when that bill was passed in this film, the gallery around the hall where the meeting's taking place is suddenly filled with people. And I found through this process there are 2 people on that platform doing the moonwalk. So that ties into my interest. And this is, I think, 1915 when this was made. So this ties into my interest about finding sameness, how all time is the same time. The past, the present, the future all exist at the same time. That everything that exists now exists then and will all exist in the future in its most simple form. So I was able to find the moonwalk in Birth of a Nation. So I'm working on stuff like that.
Whitfield?
Well, I'm doing a lot of things in my studio. I'm continuing with the Kin series, which there will be about 70 of those pieces, and I am also working on the tondos, and I've done a series of card pieces where I'm using playing cards that are collaged onto the drawings, so I'm working on that. And I'm going to be looking at the collection of photographs at the Wadsworth and doing a project a couple of years down the line, I think in 2011, which will also I'll also deal with the Beinecke collection at Yale.
Well, let's see. I have some public art commissions that I'm working on. Also, I'm working on paintings that will be made from paper that are collaged and adhered to wood and canvases, as well as collaged prints and drawings.
Great, and I think we are out of time. I got a 10-minute card about 15 minutes ago, so I think we're out of time. Can we give our panel a round of applause, please? Thank you very much for coming.